Hey, good afternoon, Paul. This is Michael here in Hong Kong, and I'm joined with Paul Smith in New Zealand from the
Hello.
Future Directors Institute. Myself, I'm the Managing Director for PDAcademia and a Council of International Schools affiliated consultant. Welcome to our newscast. Our newscast is about looking at boardroom practices through the lens of current news. Some of the news that we've been looking at the last couple months and have decided to bring or shed a light on today is about trust in the boardroom. And it's funny why this is coming up, because you can imagine now at the close of this year where we're living in such a polarized state from politics to corporate governance to even schools. You're starting to see quite a few issues over the last year or two. We talked about the LGBTQ cases back in October. We went into long-termism versus short-termism in our last newscast. So this is something that we want to finish out our last newscast and really focus on trust, so that as our viewers go into the new year, they can really be thinking about building or rebuilding trust and the importance for that. Because ultimately, if you want to achieve that vision, you're going to need people that buy into it, and to buy into it, they're going to need to trust you. But this is something that Paul is you quite passionately wanted to talk about today, and specifically about the Edelman Trust Barometer. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Edelman's, if you haven't heard of it before, it's a global PR and marketing consultancy firm. They've been running this annual survey for well over 20 years, and essentially it's a measure of trust within our society globally. So they look at trust at a country level, trust at a sector level, it's sort of NGO, government, media, those sort of main sectors, corporates, and they also look at trust within different sectors. And what we're seeing is a gradual decline of trust in our society around the media, around government, around business, and around NGOs. So again, it's not exclusive to where you stereotypically think trust is being eroded, which is, say, governments and the media. Everybody across the board, and we're sort of now in this what they call distruster territory, whereby pretty much as many people trust as distrust our institutions. And that's a dangerous place to be. If you look at different countries, it's obviously split very, very differently across different things. So really interestingly, given where you're at, China is one of the most trusting nations at a population level, whether they're what they call informed public or general population. And then what they devise as the informed public are people who are more well-read, etc. They've got this stuff to work that out. I won't go into it, but I would definitely look up Edelman's Trust Barometer if you want more information. But if you combine this with all of the stories coming out all over the world around corporate misconduct, bad behavior, you can understand, and as well as politics, as you mentioned up top, and other scandals within religion, and everything else, that at a macro scale, as well as coming down to micro scale, where there's just more and more, you can understand why trust is being eroded. And I'm just fascinated about not so much the reasons why, because I think it's obvious why trust is being eroded. Is it a new thing, or are we just having a light shined on behavior, let's just call it bad behavior, that's been going on for decades or centuries? And what can boards do about it? What other things are impacting it and making it hard to rebuild trust? And whether is trust, there's a great article I know you pulled out from the conversation in Australia about how important trust is, as well as profit, or whatever your motivator is as an organization.
Yeah, well, it's I think trust has always been an issue, because I remember back in the 90s and the early 2000s, especially when they talked about different social, what's the word I'm looking for here? Not social entrepreneurialism. That's the new one today. but we talked about corporate social responsibility, and how important that was for the bottom line for businesses, because it showed that, hey, we're not, we're doing good as well, in terms of not just making money, but in terms of improving people's lives. And you look throughout the 2000s and the end of the 90s, like the things that IKEA had to do to weather the storm about their various abuses in the various forests across the world, and how they changed it as a business. So I think trust has always been there, but it's in terms of that buzzword. 20 years ago we were talking about corporate social responsibility. Now we're talking about things in terms of diversity in the board, and so what people are focusing on changes. And what we're seeing now is also in the case of like Nissan with Carlos Ghosn, all the troubles he's had with his tax evasion. Well, that may or may not directly relate to the company itself. That's more of a personal scandal, but look how that's impacted Nissan. They've lost, probably in the last month and a half, their stocks dropped about 10 to 15%.
Yeah.
So, that's something the board has to be particularly concerned about, because even though it was personal, incompetence on his part, or, even corruption on his part, the overall business. We look at this news we use that news as a lens to look at school governance. Well, I mean, you take a look at heads of schools. If we're not bringing people into our communities that are going to be guardians of the community and help that community be able to weather change, and as well as be trusted by the community, it's going to be an uphill battle for them. And some of the things I see within schools where this specifically happens is when you have a lot of turnover in heads. Some of the schools I work with, they will literally have 5 different heads of school in a 7-year period. What kind of message does that send to your parents in the community? Obviously, they're not going to be trusting you to make these important decisions. And as a board, you're probably scratching your head saying, what's going on here? So these measures that you take, you might think you're picking the right person for the job, but are you really picking the right person for the culture and the community? And it's interesting that you wanted to talk about this today, because I started doing some research around, who do we trust? And amazingly, we're going to trust people that are similar to us. We're also going to trust people that we, develop these relationships with, that we have closer relationships to. So if we bring people into our community, we shouldn't be looking for immediate impact from them from the perspective of administration or management or bottom line. What we should be looking for them to do is to integrate themselves into the community as quickly as possible. And whether it be a new governor joining the board, or the head of school, or whoever we're bringing into the community, our attention should be immediately not to the job, but to the relationships.
There's so many amazing points you brought up in that, and I wanted to go back on like the Nissan sort of example, and we've seen more Facebook, Google, Uber, the big banks in Australia, the ABC, which is the public broadcaster in Australia. There's so many examples of misconduct, whether it's at a personal level, at a professional level inside the organization, but at an individual level or an organizational level. And we can talk for hours about the fish rots from the head and trust coming from a good culture. But I think what you touched upon there when you started talking about schools, which really fascinates me, is as you say, who do we trust? But therefore, how do we build trust? And we build trust by building relationships. We know that most boards are recruited, whether it's schools or not, by people being tapped on the shoulder because you are one of my own. Like, I was talking to a local board director, and I mentioned her the other day, and when she was recruited locally, they wanted to know, how do I know you? And they wanted to find some connection, because that built that element of trust. So when we were talking off camera beforehand about meritocracy and quotas, there is no meritocracy when it comes to that. It's like, the merit is I trust you rather than you be the best person for this job. So if you're going to recruit appropriately, and I'm going to touch on some of the skill sets I think that you need to build trust, then I think you need to be thinking about, how does that new person on the board build trust with each other, with their fellow board directors, relationships, how do they build trust with the community? That's being out there and being visible and probably communicating well. And that's what I think comes down to. It comes down to really honest, authentic communication and transparency. That's where trust comes from. And it sounds horrendously difficult. We've got to air our dirty laundry, our good and our bad in public to our stakeholders and run the risk of being, pitchforked out of town. Potentially, yes. But again, going back to our previous newscast about short-term, long-term, you've got to think long-term. I'm going to pull out a quote from the G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. The purpose of governance is precisely to create an environment of trust, transparency and accountability necessary to attain long-term financial stability and sustainable growth. And it doesn't matter what type of organization you are, trust, transparency, accountability. And I think that's what's been lacking. And so if we're going to turn it around, not only have we got to be more trustful, more transparent and more accountable, we've got to communicate this stuff too.
Well, you want to talk about how to build that trust and define boards. This was another thing we were talking about. There's a great article in the Washington Post from yesterday about millennials taking up board seats in Maryland, and specifically 5 of the 9 elected members are millennials that not only went to those schools but stayed within those districts, within those neighborhoods, and got themselves elected onto those school boards. And it's interesting because I'm reading this one quote from one of the millennials, Rahila Ahmed, 25. We bring blunt honesty. Some folks are very concerned about style and find it uncomfortable to be so forward, but it's necessary for progress to have people who are willing to do that. And it's, I think about that quote, and it's like, yeah, that's great that, you have that you can assert yourself. Not only amongst peers, but obviously those other 4 people that aren't millennials, how are you going to manage that relationship too? You still got to find that balance because you need to build trust with them. But it's also interesting too, because I saw this other opinion piece from Carly Fiorina, and let me see if I find his name again here. Carly Fiorina and Joel Peterson. So Joel Peterson was the CEO for JetBlue in the US, and Carly Fiorina, obviously a Republican, very conservative HP and presidential candidate. I'm not going to agree on a lot of things with her, but we talked about diversity in the boardroom and how you might need to mandate it. And you brought up meritocracy. Well, she's saying no, you don't mandate it, because if you're gonna say, oh, we need so many women, we need so many people of a certain race, so many people of a certain creed or cultural background. Those people are, you're gonna struggle to find that right mix of people when it's mandated, that are going to be able to fit in and work together and trust each other. Trying to figure out why they're there and what their motivations are. But one of the things that she says is that, hey, we don't need to mandate this, but it's fairly obvious we need to do this, because the culture we need to break is go along to get along. And that's, I hear I've gone on this tangent, but the message that I really want to get to is that even, across the spectrum, regardless of where you sit, conservative or liberal, the one thing we all agree is that you need to break this go along to get along mentality. And I see that a lot in schools. And it's largely because you have governors or trustees coming onto these boards that don't feel like they understand education. So they're going to go with what the head of school decides. When it comes to selecting their heads of school, they outsource it to people. They might get involved in the interview process, obviously, but when they're running their interviews, a lot of them aren't, trained in interviewing. They might be executives or from various aspects of the corporate world, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be effective interviewers. And what they're doing is they're interviewing, hey, is this person going to be the right person that I want my kid around and leading my kid? And they might be looking at it from the personal perspective from their own view, and they're building trust through likeness, which is dangerous.
Yes.
Because they're not keeping the community into perspective. And then I come back and I look at this millennial board member, Rahila, talking about, hey, we bring blunt honesty. Well, how do we kind of break this go along to get along, find people that bring blunt honesty, but are still enabled to sow that foundation for trust, so that not only people on the board will have this respect with each other and be able to operate at a very effective level, but also from the community level that they're saying, hey, that board is representative of us. There's likeness there, but also, there's merit for why they're there. And there's all these other factors too. I mean, what are some of the other factors you think that are going to contribute to a board being trusted?
Well, I would love to go back to the mandated quota stuff, but I won't, because we can talk about that another day. But I will just say on this that I agree that it would be lovely if we didn't need them, but we do, because we need the stick, because people aren't recognizing the carrot. I have a big thing for quotas and then picking the right candidate within that quota, but we won't go into that today. But I agree we do need it, right? So that we need to have that diversity in the boardroom. But we also, I think some of the things you touched on there, which I can link back to your question, is one of the things that you talked about, people, it breaks down when you get these differences in the boardroom. And because you have recruited for diversity of views, diversity of opinions. So you've got this, and again, this was a stereotype, but stereotypical blunt millennial in their 20s or early 30s, and this sort of, let's say more, let's go with another stereotype for an older generation, more deferential to authority type, who just, goes along with it, or basically says, well, hold on, we shouldn't rock the boat. So let's not be honest here, let's just sugarcoat things. So there's the two sides there, but how do we, when you've got all these differences, without, and again, this goes back to the webinar that you did, really painful that I happened to miss that because I was ill, around the constructs and the processes you can bring into the boardroom to actually create an environment whereby you can have these vastly different points of view, but still have viable, good outcomes, which everybody can agree to. And it's having those processes. But the first thing comes down to having the self-awareness and the acceptance that we need it. It has the emotional intelligence to sort of like see from people's points of view, to have your mind change potentially, to find some common ground, as opposed to what we get played out in the media, which we don't have to play out in the real life, which is like, bash, no, I'm right, bash, no, you're right. I love this, there's this one little cartoon that always comes down to this, and it's all about point of views. On the ground, there's two people, two-dimensional, facing each other, and on the ground is a 9, or is it a 6? Because they're looking at it from different angles. So one's looking at it as a 6, one's looking at a 9, and they're adamant they're right.
Yeah.
And I remember doing a self-development course, and they did the same thing with a mug, like a coffee mug with a handle. One side could only see the coffee mug with the handle, and the other side could see it without. And your job was to argue adamantly about what was in front of you. And so it's all about just coming around and seeing something from a different point of view, to say, well, you know what, someone wrote down a 9 or a 6. So it's either one or the other. So one person's right, one person's wrong. It's just someone's point of view. And I think if you go back to the question about what are some of the skill sets, after my rant, whether that was the question, what are the skill sets, it's the ability to actually shift yourself from one side to the other and see from somebody else's point of view and say, where are they coming from? Why is this millennial, this particular millennial in that article, why are they being so blunt? Why is the other side not? So again, it's as opposed to saying you're wrong, I'm right. It's a case of, well, let's try and understand what version of truth is your version of truth come from.
So there's a couple different things that we're looking at when we process the news that we're reading, and now talking about what are some practical takeaways for school boards, is first we look at things that are going on in the news. It could be about California's mandating diversity within the boardroom.
By the way, assuming that actually gets up, which I don't think it will, but.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the biggest criticisms about that came from the Carly Fiorina editorial piece was the fact that it's interesting that boards actually make up women within corporate boards, Fortune 500, are about 25%, whereas at the state level for Congress it's only 24%. So boards are actually doing better than the government. So at the government's the one mandating it. That's another reason she was pretty obviously she's staunch against government. But anyway, so some of the things we're looking at is like, all right, so in order to build trust, we need to have the right people. And what we're looking at the news from the news perspective is that there's all these different initiatives going on right now to ensure that there's greater diversity in the board, because we want the board to be more representative of the stakeholders. That's why we want we don't want diversity just for the sake of innovation. We want, let's be honest, trust is also representative of people that are like us. We want to see people at the governance level that represent our views. And unfortunately, it also comes back to all the psychological studies that show, even if you just look like me, I'm more likely to trust you as a stranger. I'm sure that's not, hopefully those aren't the decisions people are making at the board level. Hey, do they look like our demographic? But just
a side note, I don't want to disrupt your flow. This is another reason why I love working with younger people, because their visual stuff is different as they're growing up in more multicultural societies, or at least online as well. So whereas, you and I are Gen X, but we're, let's say, relatively enlightened, but probably still have those unconscious biases to visuals.
Yeah.
I think everybody still has something. So it might be at a younger age, it could be the brands you buy from, or what you believe, what your values are. Whereas for us, it could be the color of your skin, or your background, and some perceptions around that, right? And again, as you go up different generations, some stereotype. But it's another reason why I like working with young people, is that they don't see gender so much, they don't see color so much, because they're surrounded by it on a daily basis. Now, again, that's a broad brush statement, but as we go through, the lenses are changing. Sorry, I wanted to go in there because I find that fascinating.
No, I mean, yeah. So I mean, these are. I mean, I'm just bringing it back to the psychological studies, and we're looking at why there's all these initiatives to start mandating diversity. We all agree diversity is important, but how do we get there? That will be a webinar we do in terms of recruiting diversity for our boards, because there's a lot of tools out there, but you need to be committed to it, and it's something that you're doing continually. It's not once a year, or every 2 years, or every 3 years. You're continually looking for those board members.
Yeah.
But that's something we come back to. So diversity, and through the lens of the news, we can see that that's a hot topic. So if your board is not diverse, that could be potentially one reason why people are having a difficult time buying into what you're doing, because they don't see themselves represented there. The other thing we're seeing from the news, in terms of the decisions that the board's making, hey, you might have found yourself a great head of school or a CEO, but what happens when that head of school or CEO gets wrapped up in a personal financial scandal? Like Nissan, right? Hey, they were doing the best for the organization, but on the whole, they just weren't representative of the values of our shareholders or of our community. So the board themselves were making a decision based on a position, not necessarily on the needs of the community. Now, I know I'm stretching this argument with Carlos Ghosn, because he was at the head of Nissan for a long time and was very successful, and he got caught in the end. Question is, could the board have caught that going into it or during, without it being called to their attention by obviously a third party? What role does the board play in that, in ensuring the sanctity of that community? Again, that's trust. So what's the board doing to ensure that everybody within the community is behaving and acting in the right spirit? The other thing we're seeing in the news then, obviously, from this related aspect of trust, is obviously we're looking at communication. We're looking at when we do bring people into the board, how can we develop those relationships from the get-go, so that it's not about just getting right into the work. It's taking time to get to know each other and to understand each other's perspectives. Like you said, which side of the mug are you looking at? And these are all the things that are funneling up. And to be honest with you, in this hyper polarized environment that we're seeing, media plays a big part in it as well. Where people are, we were talking earlier about why is this all of a sudden becoming such an issue? Have we always been so polarized, or is it just is media bringing our awareness to it, and hence the reason we feel that we need to stand up more to it? But at the end of the day, if there's anything we've learned this year, it's what this polarization can do to an organization, to a state, to a country, to a community. And the board, above all else, should be rising above that to create that sort of harmony, so that all views can be respected, but at the same time, finding how they can get buy-in and build common understanding and consensus towards what's right for the long term of that community.
Now I know you've got a wonderful holiday anecdote to tell us to close out today's show, but there's a couple of things I want to pick up there. It's what I find about media, and it's more of a comment than something to spark off more debate or a conversation. But I think there can't be many people out there who don't know that the media are corporations who need to sell advertising space or subscriptions. So the more people they can get viewing their stories, the better. So the more controversial, the more tribal, the more clickbait they have, the better. The more angry and riled up they get people, the more they're going to get people back. And I think as a society, we know this, and yet we're still sucked into it. And I find that fascinating that, I still do it. I still do it myself. And I know I'm here talking about, we know perfectly well that their job is to get people to go to their website, so they or buy their paper newspaper for the next few years before they die out, or their magazine, like all those horrible gossip magazines, just so they can sell advertising. It's got nothing to do with anything else apart from that. Journalism, on the side, on the edges, still a little bit for some of them, hopefully more in the future. But that's one thing. But going back to the boards, I think there's one final thing that boards can do. It's really funny. It's not funny. It's fantastic timing-wise. A couple of days ago, I was interviewing a lady called Cassandra Kelly on my podcast. So Cassandra lives in New York. She's an international board director, a tech entrepreneur. She's a speaker on different things. She's spoken at the B20 and all over the world on governance issues and business issues. And we were talking about high performance teams and how, at the moment everybody's talking about high performance teams and high performance this, high performance that, from everything from corporate land to sports and everything. But we're not talking about high performance boards. And what do high performance teams have? They usually have a coach and a team of people around them to help them become high performance. Boards don't do that, and yet the impact that boards have on our world, whether it's a big corporate, a governmental board or a school board, our world, whatever that happens to be, how small and big, is huge, and yet we're not actually letting them play a level playing field. Like, it's all well and good having all the right people in the room and having a diverse room and having all of this and the other, but I actually think that boards need a coach, or they need somebody there who is independent, can actually help them do whatever it is. It doesn't have to be every single meeting. It could be in an offsite. And we've talked about retreats and offsite and making those as regular as possible. I say at least one a year, hopefully 2 a year if you can handle it, whereby you get the team together, you're creating relationships, but you bring in third parties to help coach you around all these constructs we're talking about, and you actually create a high performance board in the same way that boards are looking to bring in coaches and external mediators and consultants to create high performance teams within their organizations. We should look at the boards first, and I think I feel really strongly about that. And again,
Yeah.
to combine that with training, we've talked about training before when we talked about recruiting and, you know, and the different types of training we think boards need. And yes, that sounds really hard for a school board that has limited resources, but I think you think about, you're already getting all this time for nothing. You know, you're not paying your directors, potentially your governors. You know, maybe some schools pay their governors, but most probably don't. You're doing it voluntarily. But free up just a little bit of resources to help your board become a high performance board.
Yeah. I mean, let's connect this going back to October when we looked at the what is it, from the commune or the community? What was that? Looking back at that article from the conversation.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about, you know, trust has to be as important. And what you're just talking about in terms of a high performance team. And we can look about how trust has eroded within a team that has been so focused on performance that they're looking at numbers. And it's funny that you bring up the conversation of the 6 or the 9 is, you know, what side of the coffee cup are you looking at? Well, that's where trust can really erode, is when we're looking at these performance indicators, these key performance indicators, and from a very different light. And then we create our own narratives, or we have our own strategies for how we're going to improve it. And we have very impassioned positions, and that's what things can be quite polarized as well. And so when you talk about that high performance team, yeah, the coach is going to be incredibly important, because it's going to get the team to say, stop, let's take a step back.
Yeah.
And, you know, let's identify some rules for how we communicate. Let's create a common language for how we're going to talk about things and how we're going to make decisions. And that coach is not only in an excellent position to observe, so that they can understand where the greatest impact will be had in terms of the activities that the team needs, but they can help them understand how to have those conversations in a way that's going to be much more productive. Because it's very easy to lose sight of what's important, and it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole of key performance indicators and short-termism. I still don't believe you that long-termism and short-termism is a word. You know, once you start going down that rabbit hole, you know, and you start becoming more short-term focused, it's hard to go back up. It's hard to rebuild that trust. You have to actually purposely take yourself out, put yourself in a room related to some relationship building activities, and get to know each other again. And I'm gonna share with you my holiday anecdote, in the sense that one of the boards that I've been coaching, we started out the school year with a board retreat, based on the fact that over the last year and a half, this board is completely new. There is not anybody that's been there longer than a year and a half. And the reasons for why they had to change, I'm not going to go into, but it was a need for change. And it happened at all levels in the school, even the senior leadership positions. And that created a great amount of animosity within the community, and distrust in terms of, hey, who's watching the watchers? But from a retreat that was not focused, hey, what do we need to get done? You know, the school year is coming. What buildings need to be refurbished? You know, let's look at the benefits packages. You know, all that. You know, the doing stuff. Because, like I said, they had a huge change in terms of their administrators as well. So it was this board actually needed to get a little hands-on. But I basically, you know, when I told them, it's like, hey, if I'm going to come in and start working with you, step one, we're going to have a retreat, and we're going to bring ourselves out of that. We're going to zoom out. All right. You need to take a breath. And based on that one singular event, just even half a day of taking a breath, we were able to get a better understanding of each other's perspectives and views of the school, where it needed to go, build some consensus on areas that we could focus on, that we'd have greatest common consensus on. And that made it much easier then to start pursuing and building trust around initiatives that everybody agreed needed to be done and how to get them done. But to start that, you need to just go engage in some trust activities. And then, you know, I'm working on a project with the school as well. I was just there last week, and they're having their annual Christmas fair. And what I heard last year compared to this year, I was floored, because this year at their Christmas fair, they had a 90% attendance by parents. which for me with an international school is
Wow.
So 90% of the parents were all there with the kids, engaging in the activities. The food that was brought in was like 4 times more than what it was last year. This school, in terms of the board as well, they took time to focus on not only building relationships within, but they also identified that one of the top priorities they needed to do was building relationships with the community. And over the last 3 months, that was one of their primary focuses. It wasn't the staff benefits package, even though it's important. But one of the primary things that they agreed on that they could all do was building relationships with the community. And the first takeaway was, man, look at that Christmas bazaar. Huge.
Wow. That's amazing. You need to bottle that.
Yeah. But I mean, it's just taking the time to do those things. And then you can catch up with the other stuff later. But it's going to make the other stuff harder if you don't take that time. That's my holiday anecdote. Yeah,
it's a wonderful story to end the year with, such positivity, and it just shows, I think, everybody who's listening to this, whether now and to the future, it's possible. It's just possible with a bit of time, a bit of effort, potentially some external assistance, whatever it happens to be. It's possible to have that outcome whereby you have that level of engagement with your community and hopefully that level of trust, which is a great way to, I think, end the show.
Yeah. So, Paul, to you and yours, a happy holidays. I look forward to picking in the new year, but I hope you get a chance to take a couple of weeks just to be with yours and to turn off.
And right back to you. And I also want to say, like, the last sort of 6 months of starting on this journey together, doing the web workshops in Hong Kong and starting the webinar series in Newscast, it's been a lot of fun, and I can't wait for next year.
Great. Awesome. All right. You have a good one. Love to the family. Peace and happy holidays to the new year. And I will be speaking to you in a couple weeks' time.
And thanks for listening, everybody.
Okay.